When we picture the Battle of Kursk in 1943, we usually see tanks dueling tanks. T-34s and Panzer IVs charging each other across endless fields, tigers sniping from afar, steel beasts deciding the battle in head-on duels. But if you ask the wrecks scattered across the salient what actually killed them, the answers look very different. A lot of tanks at Kursk never even saw the vehicle that destroyed them. They hit mines. They rolled into belts of anti-tank guns they couldn't see. They were caught in artillery barrages or broke down and were abandoned, and only later finished off by whatever weapon was close at hand. In this episode, we're setting aside the cinematic duels and looking at the actual causes of tank kills. We'll treat Kursk as our test range and sort tank losses into three main buckets: guns, mines, and other tanks with artillery, air power, and breakdowns sitting in the margins. We'll dig into post-battle studies and unit reports, build a simple pie chart of what was really killing tanks, and show why, at Kursk, tanks were just one piece of a much bigger tank-killing ecosystem. Because if you're interested in how tanks actually died, Kursk delivers an awkward lesson. Their most lethal enemy usually wasn't another tank. First, a quick reality check. There is no master spreadsheet for all of Kursk, listing every single tank with a neat cause of death code. Different armies recorded things differently. Some units kept very detailed logs, others didn't, and even within one report you can get vague entries like destroyed by fire without saying whose fire that was. What we do have are good snapshots. A Soviet tank army with a proper cause of loss breakdown. German corps and divisions that tracked how their panzers were being knocked out. And some very sharp daily pictures where we can say, on this day in this sector, most losses came from this. When you line those up, they don't give you a single magic pie chart for the entire battle, but they do all point in the same direction. Let's start on the Soviet side. One of the best pieces of data we have comes from a post-battle report for 1st Tank Army, operating on the northern face of the Kursk salient. In that report, now in the Russian archives and analyzed by Richard Anderson and the Dupuy Institute, each lost or heavily damaged tank is assigned a primary cause: armor-piercing shot, artillery fire, mines, air attack, or mechanical causes. When you roll that up, you get a striking picture. Roughly 3/4 of 1st Tank Army's recorded tank losses are attributed to armor-piercing shot, AP fire, in the report. Somewhere around 15% are blamed on artillery, mostly high-explosive shells. The rest, a noticeable minority, are split between mines, air attack, and mechanical causes. There are two important details here. First, that AP category is everything that fires a solid shot: towed anti-tank guns, self-propelled guns, and tank guns all rolled together. The report doesn't tell us how much of that is tank versus tank and how much is guns knocking out tanks. Even the analysts who've studied it are careful. They'll sometimes speculate that maybe half of that AP chunk might be from tank fire, but they flag that as a guess, not a measured fact. Second, even in a battle famous for its artillery, the artillery slice of this particular pie is under a fifth. In fact, when Anderson compared 7 different World War II case studies, 1st Tank Army at Kursk was on the high end for artillery, around 14 to 15% of its tank losses attributed directly to HE shells. Most other cases came in a little lower. So in one of the biggest Soviet armored formations at Kursk, the dominant killer is AP fire. Artillery is important, but not the main factor, and mines and air attack take smaller, though not negligible, shares. Already, the cinematic image of artillery and air wiping out tank formations is giving way to something more mundane: guns and more guns. Now flip over to the German side and fast forward a few days into the offensive. You're with a panzer battalion from a division like 6th or 7th Panzer, pushing forward behind engineers through the northern face of the salient. The Soviet defense in front of you is not a line, it's a system: mine belts, trenches, and what both sides call pack fronts or anti-tank strongpoints, clusters of 45mm and 76mm guns, backed by heavier pieces, laid out to cover likely tank approaches with overlapping fire. When those divisional staffs later sit down to tally causes of loss, what they see is not mostly enemy tanks. Zetterling and Frankson reproduce a couple of these German divisional breakdowns in their statistical study of Kursk, including 6th and 7th Panzer divisions. In those samples, you see mines and anti-tank guns showing up prominently as causes, alongside a smaller contribution from enemy tanks and artillery. The tables are small and not meant to stand for the whole battle, but they match the Soviet pattern. Tanks are just one actor in a battlefield full of tank-killing hardware. To see how brutal that can be, pull the focus on one German formation for a moment. Not a whole division, but a regiment of Panthers. Panther Regiment von Lauchert goes into Operation Citadel with around 200 Panthers formally on strength. Even before the attack begins, some are lost to mechanical fires as they unload from trains. By July 5th, the start of the offensive, only 184 Panthers are operational. Within 2 days of fighting, that number has crashed to around 40. Later reports in July show more than half of the regiment's tanks either damaged and under repair or burnt out, with a significant share lost to hits and mines, and another large batch sidelined by mechanical breakdowns. In other words, the Panzerwaffe's brand new Big Cat is being shredded not just by T-34s, but by mine belts, anti-tank guns, and its own drivetrain. That mirrors what we saw in 1st Tank Army's tables. Many tanks are taken out not by fair, open-field duels, but by being trapped and crippled in prepared killing grounds. If mines and AP guns are doing so much work, how big a slice do they get on a heavy day? We actually can pin that down for one critical date. On July 5, 1943, the opening day of the German attack on the southern shoulder, 48th Panzer Corps advances into some of the heaviest minefields of the Eastern Front. When analysts later reconstruct that day's losses from the COSAVE-2 database, they estimate that of about 249 German tanks damaged or destroyed in the attacking corps, as many as 154 were casualties of mines. That's roughly 62% of the day's tank losses. Only 1 or 2 of those, including a single Panther, were actually blown to pieces by the mine blast itself. Most suffered crippled running gear, broken suspensions, ripped off tracks. Crews often survived. Many of those tanks were repaired and brought back later, but in terms of combat power on that day, they were gone. Mines had done the heavy lifting, while guns and artillery finished some off and harassed the recovery effort. That's one corps, one day, on one face of the salient. You don't lift that 62% figure and plaster it over the entire battle. But when you set it beside Soviet 1st Tank Army's cause of loss table and the German divisional samples, it reinforces the same point. Mines swallow a massive chunk of tank casualties, especially for the attacker, and pre-sighted guns pick off those who survive the mine belts. So where do tanks fit into this landscape that seems dominated by small, cheap weapons? They are absolutely part of the story. Kursk has real tank versus tank fights and some extraordinarily successful tank hunters. Think about the German heavy tank destroyer battalions equipped with Ferdinand or Elephant vehicles, basically an 88mm Pak-43 on a heavy chassis with thick armor. In the static phases of the battle, one such battalion claimed on the order of hundreds of tank kills for low own losses, thanks to its long-range gun and frontal protection. The exact numbers are claim-based and should be treated with caution, but they illustrate a key point. A lot of the AP fire that kills tanks is coming from dedicated anti-tank platforms, not from regular medium tanks. At Kursk, Tiger companies and heavy battalions were routinely positioned as long-range stoppers and counterpunchers. With excellent optics, the long 88mm gun, and thick frontal armor, they could sit hull down, cover likely avenues of approach, and reach out to ranges where most Soviet 76mm guns struggled to answer in kind. In those circumstances, they generated lopsided exchanges and often decided local fights before the medium tanks ever closed. On the Soviet side, T-34 formations do deliver devastating blows when conditions favor them. Close-range counterattacks from cover, mass charges under heavy artillery and smoke. Many German tanks are knocked out by T-34s or Soviet self-propelled guns in those chaotic clashes. those kills flow into the same AP bucket as everything else. What we can't do with the records we have is pull every one of those AP hits apart and label it tank or AT gun with precision. When a rec report just says penetrated by AP from front, that could be a Pak 40 in a field, a Stug, or a Panzer IV, and often nobody on the losing side knew which it was. So, if we sketch the Kursk cause of death chart honestly, it looks like this. A big, dominant slice for direct AP fire, all guns combined. In the Soviet 1st Tank Army sample, that's on the order of 3/4 of losses. A substantial slice for mines, especially on the German side in the opening assaults, where in some corps on some days they account for more than half of the tanks knocked out or disabled. A thinner slice for artillery HE, around 10 to 15% in the Kursk case study we can see, and an even smaller one for air attack, which is feared by crews but numerically a lesser tank killer than legend suggests. The rest is mechanical and other, breakdowns, bogging, friendly fire, and misuse. Inside that big AP slice, we know that tanks, assault guns, and towed anti-tank guns are all contributors. We know that tanks are significant, but we also know they do not own that entire slice. And behind all the numbers lurks another complication. What do you count as killed? A Panther that hits a mine, is immobilized, then abandoned under fire, and finally burned out by artillery. Who gets credit? Different staffs answered that differently. The tables were using assign a primary cause, usually the first serious damage, but on the ground, kills were often layered, mines plus guns plus HE plus the clock. When you put all of this together, Kursk stops looking like a pure tournament of tanks and starts looking like what it actually was, a test of whole anti-tank systems. On the Soviet side, that system looks like deep mine belts, layered gun lines, and strong points. On the German side, it looks like pack fronts of their own mobile anti-tank guns and combined arms doctrine wrapped around a smaller number of high-quality tanks and assault guns. Tanks are the most visible piece of each system, but they're riding on a web of much cheaper, much more numerous tank-killing tools. So, when someone asks, what really killed tanks at Kursk? Guns, mines, or other tanks? The careful answer is, most tanks died under direct AP fire, but a very large share of that fire came from anti-tank guns and dedicated tank destroyers, not just from tank guns. Mines were the single biggest cause of casualties for some German formations on key days. Artillery and air were dangerous, but in the samples we can see, they directly account for a smaller slice of tank losses than the popular image suggests. And breakdowns and abandonments quietly chipped away at both sides' armored strength in the background. Tanks absolutely killed tanks at Kursk. They just had a lot of help, from weapons you could dig in, hide under a net, or bury in the dirt, long before the big silhouettes ever came into view.